Good evening and welcome. If you enjoy quiet journeys into the stranger corners of the human past, you can like the video and subscribe. And if you feel like it, tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is there. Tonight, we're going back so far that almost everything familiar disappears. No cities, no farms, no written language, no nations, no roads, no houses in anything like the modern sense. And, possibly, for a very long stretch of time, almost no ancestors. A few years ago, a team of genetic researchers published a remarkable estimate. By reading patterns hidden inside the genomes of people alive today, they concluded that an ancestral human population may have suffered an enormous collapse beginning roughly 930,000 years ago. According to their model, the population capable of successfully passing genes into future generations may have fallen to around 1,280 breeding individuals. Not 1,280 people in one cave. Not 1,280 modern Homo sapiens waiting around a fire for the world to improve. And not necessarily only 1,280 living bodies. The number refers to what geneticists call an effective population size, which is a more complicated measure of how many individuals were contributing genetically to later generations. The real number of living ancestors may have been larger. Still, even with that qualification, the estimate was startling. The researchers suggested that the ancestral population had declined by almost 99%, and that this extremely restricted state may have lasted for something like 117,000 years. If that estimate is even approximately correct, then our evolutionary family did not pass through a brief emergency. It lived inside one, for longer than recorded civilization, has existed many times over. And that leads to the uncomfortable question at the center of tonight's story. What does it actually mean for a human lineage to become so small that extinction begins to look plausible? To understand that, we need to remove one image immediately. There was probably no moment when every surviving ancestor stood together and realized that they were the last people on Earth. There was no council around a fire. No elder announced that only 2,000 were left. No one knew the size of the population. No one even knew that a species was something that could disappear forever. The danger would have looked much more ordinary. A water source failed. A child did not survive. A group moved into another valley and was never seen again. An injured adult could no longer keep pace. Animals stopped appearing where they had appeared before. A familiar lake became smaller. A dry season lasted longer. One small population became separated from another, perhaps for a generation, perhaps for much longer. Nothing about any single day needed to feel like the end of humanity. And yet, over enough generations, ordinary losses can produce an extraordinary result. Around 900,000 years ago, the creatures experiencing those losses were not yet Homo sapiens. Our species would emerge hundreds of thousands of years later. These earlier humans belonged to populations of the genus Homo, whose exact identities are still debated. They inhabited parts of Africa and Eurasia, used stone technologies that already had deep histories behind them, and lived in environments where survival depended on mobility, memory, social cooperation, and an intimate understanding of landscapes that could change without warning. Their world was not primitive in the sense of being simple. It was complicated in a different way. A modern person can spend years barely noticing where drinking water comes from. For these ancestors, water was geography. It determined where people could stop, where animals gathered, which routes were practical, and how long a group could remain in one place before moving again. Food was much the same. There was no general category called groceries. There were particular routes in particular soils, particular trees bearing fruit at particular times, animals moving through particular regions, carcasses that could be reached before other scavengers claimed them, stones suitable for making cutting edges, sometimes found close by and sometimes not. Knowledge existed inside people. There were no books to preserve it, no maps, no written instructions. If a person knew where a reliable dry season water source lay beyond a distant ridge, that knowledge survived only if someone else learned it, and the environment itself was not stable. This period sits within a long climatic transition during the Pleistocene, when patterns of glacial and environmental change were becoming more intense and, in many places, more disruptive. The important word is not simply cold, it is unpredictability. Cold can be adapted to, dryness can be adapted to, even scarcity can sometimes be adapted to if it follows a recognizable rhythm. Uncertainty is harder. A route that worked for generations can fail. A lake can shrink. Vegetation can change. Animals can move somewhere else. A place remembered as safe can become useless. And in a world without stored grain, deep wells, emergency transport, or assistance arriving from somewhere outside the local landscape, environmental mistakes were expensive. Suppose a small group travelled toward a water source, remembered from previous years. The journey might take hours or days. Adults carry tools. Someone may be carrying an infant. Young children slow the pace. An older or injured person changes how quickly everyone can move. Then the group arrives. The water is gone. No catastrophe needs to occur at that moment. No one needs to die immediately. The danger appears in smaller decisions. Do they continue? Turn back? Split up? Follow animals? Move toward another group whose territory may already be under pressure? Every option consumes energy. Every delay consumes water. And every wrong decision is harder to absorb when there are fewer people. Small populations are fragile in ways large populations are not. In a community of thousands, the death of one skilled adult is painful. In a tiny and isolated group, the same death may remove a rare skill, a reproductive partner, remembered geography, or the connection between two family lines. An unlucky year can distort the age structure of a group. Several failed births matter. Several injured adults matter. A disease that would be a tragedy in a large population can become a demographic event in a small one. And then there is distance. The surviving population, if the genetic bottleneck was real, almost certainly was not gathered together. People would have existed in separate groups, scattered across enormous landscapes. That means two populations could survive at the same time and still be effectively lost to one another. A mountain range, a dry corridor, a changed river, or hundreds of kilometers of unsuitable habitat can become a wall without anyone ever building one. When groups stop exchanging people, their future becomes narrower. There are fewer potential mates. Relatedness increases. Chance becomes more important. The disappearance of one group is harder for another to repair. This is one reason the famous figure of roughly 1,280 is so unsettling. The number is not frightening because 1,280 sounds small when compared with 8 billion people today. It is frightening because populations do not merely need individuals. They need connections between individuals. They need enough children to survive, enough adults to reproduce, enough movement between groups. Enough diversity, enough good years to compensate for bad ones. And they need these things again and again, generation after generation. If the 2023 genetic reconstruction is correct, this problem may have persisted for roughly 117,000 years. That number is difficult to feel, so consider something much closer to us. Agriculture began only around 12,000 years ago. The first cities are younger still. The pyramids of Egypt are only a few thousand years old. All of recorded history occupies a very thin slice of time compared with 117,000 years. A population bottleneck lasting that long would contain thousands of generations. People would be born into it without knowing there had ever been anything different. Their children would do the same. Entire landscapes could change. Groups could disappear. Others might expand for a while and shrink again. A favorable period could last centuries and still be temporary when viewed across such a span. There is no reason to picture one uninterrupted nightmare. That would almost certainly be wrong. There would have been good mornings, successful hunts, children playing, quiet nights, full stomachs, periods when a local population increased, periods when water was plentiful. Life does not need to feel catastrophic for extinction risk to remain present in the background. That may be the strangest part of this entire subject. Near extinction, if it happened, was probably not experienced as near extinction. It was experienced as weather, distance, pregnancy, injury, a missed season, a dry river, a group that did not return. And then there is another complication. The more closely scientists have looked at this dramatic bottleneck, the less certain the story has become. Later, genetic analyses have challenged the idea that our ancestors truly fell to anything like 1,280 effective breeders. Other researchers have suggested that ancient populations may instead have been divided into separate groups in ways that can create a genetic signal resembling a catastrophic crash. In other words, the mystery may not be whether a handful of humans survived one apocalypse. The mystery may be whether the apocalypse existed in the form we first imagined at all. And that matters because there is another famous human near-extinction story waiting much later in time. About 74,000 years ago, one of the most violent volcanic eruptions of the last several million years tore open the landscape of Sumatra. The Toba supereruption would eventually become connected in the popular imagination with human extinction, genetic bottlenecks, and even the emergence of modern human behavior. It is a wonderfully neat story, almost too neat, because the deeper we go, the more the human past refuses to behave that way. Before we reach Toba, however, we need to understand the world in which the much older bottleneck may have happened. A world where a stone edge could determine whether meat could be processed, where a damaged foot could alter the movement of an entire group, where darkness actually meant darkness, and where survival depended on remembering a landscape that was slowly becoming less willing to be remembered. For people living hundreds of thousands of years before cities, survival did not depend on one dramatic skill. It depended on dozens of small things continuing to work. Feet had to remain usable. Hands had to remain steady enough to cut, carry, shape, and hold. Teeth had to remain functional enough to chew. Children had to survive long enough to become adults. Adults had to survive long enough to raise them. And a group had to know when to move before the landscape made that decision for them. One of the clearest objects from this world is also one of the easiest to underestimate: the stone hand axe. To us, a hand axe can look almost disappointingly simple. A shaped piece of stone with a cutting edge, sometimes symmetrical, sometimes rougher. Something that seems to belong behind glass in a museum. But that is because we see the object without the problem it was built to solve. A sharp stone edge could open an animal carcass. It could separate hide from flesh, cut tendons, slice meat, work wood, process plants, and produce fresh flakes when another sharp edge was needed. The important part is not that early humans had one clever tool. It is that one portable object could solve several different problems in a world where carrying capacity mattered. Everything you carried cost energy. There were no backpacks filled with specialized equipment. No spare knife, spare saw, spare container, spare repair kit. A useful piece of stone was valuable, partly because it reduced the number of separate things you needed. And useful stone was not everywhere. Some rock fractures into sharp, predictable edges, some does not. A group moving through a landscape had to notice the difference. Good raw material could be collected when available, shaped, carried, and sometimes transported away from the place where it had been found. That adds another layer to prehistoric movement. People were not simply moving toward food or water. They were also moving through a mental map of useful materials. Water here, tubers there, animals along this route. Stone in that exposed ridge, shade beyond that open plain. The landscape was not scenery. It was inventory. And unlike a modern inventory, it could not be written down. The entire system depended on memory. That made older, experienced individuals potentially valuable in ways that are difficult for archaeology to preserve. A person who knew that water sometimes remained in a depression beyond a particular ridge during a severe dry period did not need to be physically strong to matter. Someone who remembered where suitable stone could be found might save others many hours of searching. Someone familiar with animal movements might recognize that a herd disappearing from one region did not necessarily mean it had vanished, only that it had shifted. Knowledge could reduce risk, but knowledge also had a weakness. It depended on the world continuing to behave roughly as remembered. Environmental instability could turn experience into a trap. A lake that had existed for generations could shrink. A route that once crossed wet grassland could become dry and exposed. Animals could shift their range. Vegetation could retreat. And the oldest person in the group could make a completely reasonable decision based on information that was no longer true. There is something especially dangerous about a world that changes just slowly enough for memory to remain useful, but quickly enough for memory to occasionally fail. That is the sort of world these populations may have inhabited. When resources became less predictable, movement became more important. But movement has costs of its own. Humans are unusually good endurance walkers, yet every journey still consumes calories and water. Young children reduce pace. Pregnancy reduces pace. Injury reduces pace. Illness reduces pace. An older adult with worn joints reduces pace. And the group cannot simply leave every slow person behind without losing the social and reproductive structure that keeps the population functioning. This is where something as ordinary as a foot becomes important. A cut foot is rarely discussed in grand accounts of human evolution. There is no dramatic fossil layer, called the age of the blister. Yet for a mobile population, the ability to walk is fundamental. A thorn driven deeply into the sole, a badly bruised heel, a fractured toe, an infected cut, or swelling around an ankle can transform one person from a contributor into someone who needs assistance. That does not automatically mean death. Humans are social animals precisely because individuals can support one another. But support costs time and energy. Someone moves more slowly. Someone carries more. A journey takes longer. More water is consumed before the group reaches the next source. If food is scarce, delay becomes more expensive. Small problems begin interacting with other small problems. That is how demographic pressure works. Not as a single blow, but as accumulated friction. Hands were just as important. Stone tools can be astonishingly sharp. A fresh flake can cut skin easily, and shaping stone is not a risk-free activity. A badly placed strike can ruin a tool blank. It can waste useful raw material. It can also injure the person doing the work. Again, the point is not to imagine prehistoric people constantly cutting themselves. Experienced toolmakers were skilled. The point is that hands were part of the survival system. An injured hand affects carrying, cutting, tool production, climbing, food processing, and care for children. Modern life contains enormous amounts of redundancy. If one tool breaks, another can often replace it. If one hand is injured, machines continue doing much of the work around you. In the early Stone Age, the human body was much more directly connected to production. The body was the transport system. The body was the tool user. The body was the food processor. The body was the shelter builder, where shelters were used. And when the body failed, technology could only compensate so much. Teeth created a similar vulnerability. Long before dentistry, tooth wear was simply part of aging. Hard particles in food, grit, repetitive chewing, and accidents could damage teeth over time. A broken tooth might remain painful. An infection could become serious. A person surrounded by food might still struggle if chewing became difficult. This is another reason food processing mattered. Cutting, pounding, crushing, and perhaps cooking, where fire was controlled, could reduce the work required from teeth and digestive systems. Early humans were already using stone to process plants and animal tissues long before the period we are discussing. The technology changed what the body had to do. That is an important theme in human evolution. Tools do not merely give humans new abilities. They move effort from the body into objects. A cutting edge allows stone to do part of the work that teeth and fingers would otherwise have to perform. A hammerstone allows force to be concentrated. Fire, when available, transforms food chemically before it enters the mouth. Each technology reduces one kind of biological constraint while creating new practical demands. Fire is probably the most dramatic example. There is evidence for hominin-associated burning at Wonderwerk Cave in South Africa roughly 1 million years ago, close enough to our period to show that at least some early humans were interacting with fire in meaningful ways. But we should resist the comfortable image of every group carrying a perfectly controlled campfire through every landscape. The timing of habitual, widespread fire control remains debated. Some populations may have used fire regularly. Others may have used it intermittently. Some may have depended partly on naturally occurring fire before increasingly reliable control developed. What matters for our story is how radically fire changes the problem of night. With fire, darkness contracts. There is a visible circle. Faces can be seen. Hands can continue working. Food can be heated. Cold becomes easier to manage. Some predators may be discouraged from approaching. Smoke rises. People gather. The day does not end quite so completely at sunset. Without fire, darkness becomes much larger. In a modern city, darkness is almost never total. Even at night, there is usually a lamp, a screen, a streetlight, a distant window, or reflected light from somewhere beyond the horizon. For early humans, away from moonlight or open sky, darkness could remove vision almost completely. Then hearing becomes more important. A branch moves, an animal calls, something passes through vegetation, wind changes direction, rain approaches, an infant begins crying. The group may recognize most of these sounds perfectly well. They are not helpless, but recognition has limits when the source remains unseen. Predators shared these environments. Large carnivores were not supernatural terrors stalking humanity every night, but they were a genuine ecological pressure. Hyenas, big cats, and other dangerous animals could compete for carcasses, occupy useful spaces, and threaten vulnerable individuals. Early humans were hunters in some contexts and scavengers in others, but they were also animals living among other predators. The relationship was not simple. A carcass could be food. It could also be a trap. An animal killed by another predator might offer valuable calories if the original hunter had left. But the original hunter might return. Other scavengers might arrive. The smell of blood attracts attention. Processing meat quickly becomes useful. Here again, the stone edge matters. You do not want to spend unnecessary time beside a carcass. A good cutting tool reduces the amount of time needed to remove useful tissue. Technology, therefore, affects exposure to danger. The same object that increases access to food also reduces the time spent in a risky location. That is a much richer way of understanding tools than simply saying that humans became better hunters. Food itself was rarely one stable category. Early Homo populations were flexible consumers. Plants mattered. Animal foods mattered. Underground storage organs, such as roots and tubers, could matter. Seeds, nuts, fruit, and other resources varied by location and season. This flexibility may have been one of the most important qualities these populations possessed. A specialist animal can be extraordinarily successful when its preferred habitat is abundant. But specialization becomes dangerous when the environment changes. Humans increasingly occupied a different ecological strategy. They were not the fastest animals. They were not the strongest. They had no claws, no thick fur, no enormous teeth. Instead, they combined social learning, mobility, technology, flexible diets, and increasingly sophisticated ways of obtaining resources. That package is less spectacular than a lion's body. It is also remarkably adaptable. During periods of environmental instability, adaptability may matter more than perfection. If one food disappears, another may become important. If one route closes, another can be explored. If one habitat becomes less productive, groups may move. But this flexibility has limits. You can only move if another viable region exists. You can only shift foods if you know how to obtain and process alternatives. You can only reach another population if geography allows contact. And you can only survive long periods of uncertainty if enough members of the group remain healthy enough to keep all of these systems functioning. Children create the clearest example. Human childhood is unusually long. Our offspring remain dependent for years. Even in earlier Homo populations, child development already demanded prolonged investment compared with many other mammals. An infant cannot walk with the group. It must be carried. That requires an adult to spend energy carrying both their own body and another. As the child grows, Movement becomes easier in one way and more difficult in another. A toddler can walk, but not efficiently across every landscape. Young children need food. They need protection. They make noise. They become tired. They become sick. And yet a population cannot survive without them. This creates one of the deepest contradictions in human biology. Children are expensive precisely because they are essential. A small population under stress cannot simply maximize short-term efficiency. It must continue carrying its future. Pregnancy adds further costs. A pregnant adult needs additional energy. Late pregnancy can make long-distance movement more difficult. Birth carries risks. After birth, feeding an infant requires further calories. In a large and well-connected population, individual reproductive failures are absorbed more easily. In a tiny population, repeated losses matter more. This does not mean every birth becomes a desperate extinction event. Nobody living inside the population sees it that way. But across generations, the arithmetic accumulates. A few fewer children surviving here. A few adults lost there. A group failing to meet another group for several years. A local drought. An epidemic. A failed migration. One lineage ends, then another. The population becomes genetically narrower without anyone experiencing a single day when humanity nearly disappears. That quietness is what makes the bottleneck hypothesis so haunting. We instinctively imagine extinction as spectacle. The sky changes color. The volcano erupts. Animals flee. People run. But population collapse does not require spectacle. It can happen in good weather. It can happen while someone is shaping a hand axe. It can happen while a child learns where water is found. It can happen while a group successfully hunts. A population may be shrinking, even when individual lives still contain long periods of ordinary success. And that brings us back to fire. If early groups could maintain it, fire offered warmth and protection. But fire also created work. Fuel had to be gathered. Wet wood was difficult. Wind could scatter sparks. Smoke could irritate eyes and lungs. A poorly placed fire could be dangerous. And if keeping a fire alive mattered, someone had to pay attention to it. A fire that went out might mean cold, darkness, or the labor of producing another one, depending on how confidently that group could create flame. There is a tempting tendency to think that once humans discover a technology, the problem is permanently solved. Human history rarely works that way. Technology usually converts one problem into several smaller ones. Fire reduces cold but requires fuel. Tools increase cutting ability but require material and skill. Mobility reduces dependence on one habitat but requires energy. Social groups provide protection but require food for more mouths. Children secure the future but slow movement. Every solution has maintenance costs. For a population living near its ecological limits, maintenance is everything. That may help explain why environmental instability matters so much in discussions of early human evolution. A changing environment does not only reduce food, it places stress on the entire network of solutions that people have built around their surroundings. A familiar plant becomes rarer. Now more walking is required. More walking means more water. More water means dependence on reliable sources. Those sources may also be changing. Longer journeys increase exposure to injury. Injuries slow the group. A slower group reaches resources later. The consequences begin stacking. No single link has to be catastrophic. Together, they can become demographic pressure. And yet early humans continued to exist. For hundreds of thousands of years, different populations repeatedly survived environmental disruption. They returned to landscapes after major ecological change. They persisted in places that shifted between wet and dry conditions. They adapted technologies. They moved. They learned. Whatever exactly happened during the proposed ancient bottleneck, these were not helpless creatures barely capable of responding to their environment. They belonged to a lineage that had already been experimenting with flexibility for an enormous span of time. And this is where the story begins to become stranger. Because if flexibility, tools, movement, and social cooperation were already powerful survival strategies, why would an ancestral population ever fall as low as the genetic model suggests? A temporary catastrophe might explain a sharp decline, but 117,000 years is not temporary. To keep a population restricted for that long, something deeper may have been happening. Perhaps climates became unusually difficult. Perhaps populations fragmented. Perhaps the fossil record is hiding important regions. Or perhaps the dramatic bottleneck is partly an illusion produced by the way ancient populations were structured. To understand that, we have to leave the campfire and look at the landscape on a much larger scale, not at one group of humans. At continents, at ice, at rainfall, at lakes, appearing and disappearing across generations, because around 900,000 years ago, the planet itself was changing its rhythm. Around 900,000 years ago, the danger facing our ancestors may not have arrived as a single disaster. There is no evidence for one enormous eruption at exactly the right moment, no known impact crater that neatly explains the population decline, and no single terrible year that can be pointed to as the beginning of the crisis. Instead, something slower was happening. The climate system itself was changing. Earth had already been cycling through colder and warmer periods for millions of years, driven partly by subtle variations in the planet's orbit and orientation. Ice sheets expanded and retreated. Rainfall patterns shifted. Habitats moved with them, but during the broad period known as the mid-Pleistocene transition, those rhythms began changing. Earlier glacial cycles had been strongly influenced by a rhythm of roughly 41,000 years. Over time, much larger and longer glacial cycles became increasingly prominent, eventually approaching something closer to 100,000 years. For an animal living through one afternoon, this means nothing. For a lineage surviving across thousands of generations, it can transform the world. The important consequence was not that every place suddenly became cold. Africa did not turn into an enormous frozen wasteland, and our ancestors were not marching through permanent snow. Climate change rearranges environments in much more complicated ways. Rain falls somewhere else. A lake expands, then contracts. Grassland replaces woodland. Woodland returns. Dry regions spread. Animal communities reorganize. Plants that once grew reliably in one place become less common there, and populations that have adapted to one combination of resources suddenly find themselves living inside another. At places such as Acheulean, in what is now Kenya, the geological record preserves a landscape that changed repeatedly over enormous stretches of time. Lakes appeared and disappeared. Sediments record alternating conditions. Animal communities changed. Hominins returned again and again to a region that did not remain environmentally stable. That persistence is impressive. It also reveals the problem. A landscape does not need to become completely uninhabitable to make life harder. It only needs to become less predictable. Consider water again. A lake is much more than a large container of something to drink. Its presence influences vegetation. Vegetation attracts herbivores. Herbivores attract predators and scavengers. Wet ground supports different plants from dry ground. Birds arrive. Fish may be available. Trees and shrubs may cluster around water. The surrounding landscape becomes a network of opportunities centered on that one feature. Then, the lake begins to shrink. At first, that may seem useful. Animals become concentrated around the remaining water. Hunting or scavenging opportunities might improve temporarily. People know where animals will gather, but concentration has another side. Predators know too. Other hominin groups may arrive for exactly the same reason. Water becomes dirtier. The distance between suitable places grows. Plants dependent on wetter conditions retreat. A temporary advantage becomes a bottleneck of its own. And eventually, if the water disappears, the entire local system reorganizes. Nobody living through this needs to understand climate. They only need to notice that the old place no longer works. The same problem applies to animals. Early humans did not exist above the food web. They were embedded inside it. When rainfall changed vegetation, herbivores responded. Some populations moved, some declined. Specialist species could suffer particularly badly if the environments to which they were adapted became less common. This is one reason flexibility appears so repeatedly in discussions of human evolution. A creature perfectly suited to one habitat can outperform a generalist while that habitat remains stable. But the advantage can reverse when conditions become unreliable. Our ancestors carried part of their adaptation with them. A stone tool still works when the vegetation changes. Knowledge can be applied somewhere else. A flexible diet allows different resources to become important. Social learning allows one person's discovery to become another person's behavior. Movement allows a population to leave. But none of these abilities guarantees survival. Leaving one deteriorating landscape only helps if somewhere better can be reached. And the farther populations must travel, the more geography begins to divide them. This may be one of the most important pieces of the bottleneck mystery. When we hear that an ancestral population may have fallen dramatically, it is natural to imagine mass death. But a genetic bottleneck can also be shaped by separation. Suppose a population that once exchanged individuals across a broad region becomes fragmented as habitats change. One group remains near a lake basin. Another follows resources farther south. Another survives in a wetter region separated by increasingly dry terrain. Another disappears locally. The people in those surviving groups do not need to be starving. They may be doing reasonably well. But if they stop meeting one another, the genetic population begins behaving differently. Connections disappear. And once populations become isolated, chance becomes much more powerful. This possibility is now especially important because it may help explain why scientists disagree about the severity of the ancient bottleneck. The original genetic estimate of roughly 1,280 effective breeding individuals assumes a particular relationship between genetic variation and population history. But ancient populations were not necessarily one large, evenly mixing community. They could have been subdivided. They could separate and reconnect. Genes could move between populations irregularly. Some groups could disappear, while others persisted. Later, populations could merge. That messy structure can leave patterns in genomes that are difficult to distinguish from a simple population crash. So there are at least two very different versions of what may have happened around 900,000 years ago. In the first, the ancestral population truly collapsed to an extraordinarily small number. In the second, there were more ancestors alive, but they were divided among populations whose changing connections produced part of the genetic signal that later researchers interpreted as catastrophic decline. These scenarios would have felt completely different to the people living through them, and neither would have looked like an apocalypse. If fragmentation was important, the crisis might have been experienced primarily as distance. A group that once appeared occasionally stops appearing. A route becomes too dry. A river changes. A stretch of habitat that could once be crossed becomes increasingly difficult. There is no farewell. There may not even be an awareness that contact has ended permanently. People simply stop meeting. Years pass. Children grow up who have never encountered the other population. The social world becomes smaller. This matters because humans are unusual, not simply for living socially, but for depending so heavily on socially transmitted information. Even before the elaborate exchange networks documented much later in Homo sapiens, early Homo populations had to acquire skills from others. Stone technology alone demonstrates transmission across generations. Acheulean hand axes were produced across vast spans of geography and time. Whatever precise methods people used to teach and learn, nobody independently rediscovered the entire technological tradition from nothing in every generation. Young individuals observed. They practiced. They failed. They improved. Useful behavior persisted. That creates another vulnerability in very small populations. Population decline can reduce not only genetic diversity, but cultural diversity. This idea has to be handled carefully because we cannot reconstruct the exact knowledge possessed by a group 900,000 years ago. But the general problem is straightforward. Skills exist in people. If very few people know a difficult technique and those people disappear, the technique can disappear with them. The same applies to environmental knowledge. Where does suitable stone occur? Which plants require processing before they can be eaten? Where is water likely to remain when the obvious sources disappear? Which animal tracks are worth following? Which routes lead through difficult terrain? Some knowledge can be rediscovered. Some may take generations to recover, and some may never return. This makes population size more than a biological statistic. A population is also a reservoir of information. The larger and better connected it is, the more information can potentially circulate. The smaller and more fragmented it becomes, the easier it is for knowledge to vanish locally. Environmental instability, therefore, creates two related pressures. It changes the resources people need to understand, and it can separate the people who hold different pieces of that understanding. That combination may have been particularly difficult during the climatic transformations surrounding the proposed bottleneck. There is another reason the climate explanation remains attractive. The bottleneck, if it occurred as originally estimated, lasted far too long to resemble most familiar disasters. A volcanic eruption can devastate a region. A drought can last years or decades. A disease outbreak can move rapidly through a population. But maintaining extremely low effective population size for something like 117,000 years suggests either repeated pressure, long-term ecological constraint, complex population structure, or some combination of these. Climate operates on exactly those long scales. It does not need to kill everyone. It can repeatedly prevent recovery. A population begins expanding. Conditions worsen. Expansion stops. Another region becomes favorable. People move. That region later changes. Groups separate. One disappears. Another grows. Contact resumes somewhere else. Over thousands of generations, the population can remain restricted even though no single generation experiences the entire pattern. This is why the number 117,000 is more interesting than the number 1,280. The smaller number attracts attention. The longer one reveals the real mystery. If a human lineage genuinely remained under such severe demographic pressure for more than 100,000 years, why did it not disappear? Small populations are vulnerable to randomness. A few unusually bad years can matter. Sex ratios can become unfavorable. Local disease can remove important age groups. Environmental disasters can eliminate entire communities. Inbreeding becomes more likely when populations remain isolated. Genetic diversity declines. Each of these effects can make recovery harder, and yet something survived. Perhaps many separated populations did. Perhaps they were never as few as the most dramatic model suggests. But whatever the demographic details, the broader evolutionary record tells us that ancestral humans continued through a period of substantial environmental change. This is where adaptability stops sounding like a pleasant personality trait and becomes something much more serious. Adaptability means eating what was not previously preferred because the preferred resource is gone. It means moving when staying would be easier. It means applying an old tool to a new problem. It means learning a landscape that your parents did not know. It can mean abandoning information that had been correct for generations. That last part may be especially difficult. Knowledge is valuable because it prevents constant experimentation. If every generation had to rediscover everything, cultural life would barely accumulate. But environmental instability creates situations in which inherited knowledge must sometimes be questioned. The spring your parents used may have dried. The animals may no longer follow the same route. The plants may ripen differently. The landscape can make tradition wrong. A lineage capable only of repeating successful behavior from the past is therefore vulnerable when the past stops resembling the present. Human adaptability seems to have increasingly involved something else: retaining knowledge while also being capable of changing behavior, not abandoning tradition completely, not obeying it completely, using it until reality provides a reason not to. Across evolutionary time, that balance becomes enormously powerful. It may also help explain why human evolution is so closely associated with environmental variability rather than one perfect ancestral habitat. Our lineage did not emerge from a landscape that remained conveniently unchanged while brains grew larger. Different hominin populations lived through repeated ecological disruptions. Some disappeared. Others adapted. New forms emerged. Populations expanded and contracted. And eventually, much later, members of Homo sapiens would carry this flexible strategy into deserts, forests, highlands, cold steppe, tropical coastlines, and eventually almost every major terrestrial environment on Earth. But that future was not guaranteed. Around 900,000 years ago, if the severe bottleneck hypothesis is correct, the lineage may have been dangerously close to losing the opportunity altogether. There is an odd problem, however. A demographic catastrophe of that scale ought to make us want physical evidence. If almost 99% of an ancestral population disappeared, where are the traces of the disaster? Where are the abandoned landscapes? Where is the obvious archaeological rupture? Where are the fossils showing the population collapsing? The answer is uncomfortable. We do not have them. At least, not in the simple form we would like. There is a sparse and uneven hominin fossil record across parts of the period in question, and the researchers who proposed the bottleneck pointed to gaps in that record as potentially consistent with severe population decline. But fossils are treacherous witnesses. Most bodies never fossilize. Most fossils that do form remain buried. Most buried fossils will never be exposed where humans can find them. And the places archaeologists have investigated represent an almost absurdly tiny fraction of the landscapes ancient hominins once occupied. A missing fossil can mean a missing population. It can also mean bad preservation, or erosion, or sediment covering the right layer, or simply that nobody has dug in the right place yet. The same silence can support several stories. This is one reason the ancient bottleneck remains so fascinating. We have a possible catastrophe reconstructed largely from the DNA of people alive nearly 1 million years later. We have a changing climate capable of creating enormous ecological pressure. We have a fossil record sparse enough to leave room for the hypothesis, but we do not have a prehistoric graveyard containing the victims of a clearly identifiable human near-extinction. The catastrophe, if it happened, left no simple monument. Its possible monument is us, and even that monument is difficult to read, because the genetic signal that created the entire story would soon become the subject of a scientific argument. One group of researchers looked backward through modern genomes and saw an ancestral population collapsing toward roughly 1,280 effective breeders. Other researchers looked at the same deep past with different methods and began seeing something else. Thousands more. Separated populations. Uncertainty. Perhaps no extreme collapse at all. And suddenly, the question was no longer simply how our ancestors survived near extinction. It became whether we had correctly identified the extinction crisis in the first place. For most of human history, nobody could have suspected that our bodies contained records of populations that had vanished hundreds of thousands of years before us. Bones were understandable. A tooth could be excavated. A stone tool could be held in the hand. An ancient hearth could leave ash behind. DNA offered something stranger. The possibility that people living today might preserve traces of demographic events far older than Homo sapiens itself. This is where the number at the beginning of our story came from. In 2023, researchers published a study based on genomic data from 3,154 present-day people. They used a method called FITCOL, short for Fast Infinitesimal Time Coalescent Process, to reconstruct changes in ancestral effective population size deep into the past. The mathematics behind this becomes complicated very quickly, but the basic idea is surprisingly intuitive. Every person carries genetic variants inherited from earlier generations. Move backward through time, and the family tree begins to converge. Two copies of a gene that exist in different people today eventually trace back to shared ancestral copies. Population geneticists call this process coalescence. How frequently those ancestral lineages converge contains information about population history. In a very large population, genetic lineages can remain separate for a long time. In a smaller population, there are fewer possible ancestors, so lineages tend to meet more quickly as we trace them backward. Modern genomes therefore contain statistical patterns that can be used to estimate how large ancestral breeding populations may have been. This is not the same thing as discovering an ancient census. No one found a list containing 1,280 names. The researchers built a demographic model from patterns of genetic variation, and their model produced an extraordinary result. Beginning around 930,000 years ago, the effective population size of the ancestral population they were studying appeared to collapse. The estimate fell to roughly 1,280 breeding individuals. According to the reconstruction, this represented a decline of approximately 98.7%, and the population remained severely restricted until roughly 813,000 years ago. Something like 117,000 years. The researchers also estimated that this bottleneck could have eliminated around 2/3 of the genetic diversity carried by the ancestral population. That was the result that traveled around the world. Human ancestors, headlines suggested, had nearly gone extinct. It is easy to understand why. A decline of almost 99% sounds like the biological equivalent of an empty planet. But there are two important corrections. The first is the one we have already encountered. 1,280 was an estimate of effective population size. The number of actual living individuals could have been considerably larger. Effective population size is influenced by how many individuals reproduce, variation in reproductive success, population structure, sex ratios, and other demographic factors. So, if we placed a camera over Africa 900,000 years ago and somehow counted every relevant hominin, we should not expect the counter necessarily to stop at 1,280. The second correction is even more important. The estimate is a model result, and models can disagree. This is not a weakness unique to genetics. It is simply what happens when scientists try to reconstruct events for which no direct census exists. Consider the difficulty. The researchers were trying to estimate population conditions nearly 1 million years ago using genomes sampled in the present. Between the event and the evidence lie countless generations of reproduction, migration, separation, extinction, population expansion, population contraction, and later mixing. Mutation continued. Recombination shuffled genetic material. Different populations separated and encountered one another. Some ancient groups contributed genes to later populations. Others disappeared. The genetic record is real, but reading it requires assumptions about the processes that produced it. And population structure is particularly troublesome. Suppose, for simplicity, that an ancestral population contains many thousands of individuals. If all of them regularly exchange genes, the population behaves in one way genetically. Now separate them into several groups. Allow contact occasionally. Stop contact for long periods. Let one population expand while another declines. Then reconnect some of them. Even if the total number of living individuals never falls to an extraordinary minimum, the resulting genetic patterns can sometimes resemble those created by a population bottleneck. This is one reason the image of the last 1,280 humans can be misleading. The deep past may have contained something much messier. There may have been populations distributed across different parts of Africa, and perhaps beyond it, experiencing different environments and different demographic histories. Some could have been isolated, some could have disappeared, some could have exchanged genes after long periods apart. And when all of that complexity is compressed into a model that asks how population size changed through time, structure can sometimes masquerade as collapse. That possibility became central to the debate after the original study appeared. In 2024, researchers published a challenge arguing that the dramatic bottleneck signal was likely a statistical artifact. They questioned whether the genomic patterns truly required an ancestral population to have fallen to such an extraordinary minimum. Then another challenge arrived. A newer method, called PLASH, was developed to reconstruct ancient population histories using whole genome information, while also representing uncertainty in ways designed to improve deep demographic inference. When researchers applied this approach to the period of the proposed bottleneck, they did not find strong evidence for a collapse approaching 1,280 effective individuals. Their estimates generally placed ancient minimum effective population sizes much higher, commonly around 10 to 15,000, with none of the relevant populations dropping below roughly 5,000 during the proposed interval. 5,000 is still a small effective population by modern standards. 10,000 is still tiny beside the billions alive today. But it is a very different evolutionary situation from 1,280. Suddenly, one of the most dramatic claims about human ancestry had two incompatible readings. One method saw a lineage pushed frighteningly close to disappearance. Another saw a much larger population. Neither side could travel back 900,000 years and count. This is where science becomes more interesting than the clean version often presented afterward. A published result does not become permanent truth simply because the number is memorable. Other researchers try to break it. They test the assumptions. They use different data. They build different models. They ask whether another demographic history could produce the same signal. And sometimes the beautiful explanation survives. Sometimes it becomes more complicated. Sometimes it disappears. As of now, the severe bottleneck remains a contested hypothesis rather than a settled episode in human evolution. That does not make the original discovery meaningless. It changes the question. Instead of asking only, how did 1,280 ancestors save humanity? We have to ask something more difficult. What kind of ancient population history could leave such an extreme signal inside modern genomes? A true collapse is one answer. Long-term population structure is another. There may also be histories more complicated than either simple alternative. Ancient populations can split and merge. They can exchange small amounts of genetic material. They can become isolated for long periods and later reconnect. One population can contribute disproportionately to descendants, while another, although larger at the time, eventually leaves little detectable ancestry. That last point is easy to overlook. Being alive is not the same thing as becoming an ancestor of people alive today. An ancient population can flourish for thousands of years and eventually disappear without contributing much genetic material to later populations. Another tiny population can happen to leave descendants whose descendants expand enormously. When we reconstruct ancestry from living genomes, we are therefore looking backward through the lineages that survived. The dead ends are harder to see. This creates a kind of survivor bias written into genetics. The human populations represented in our genomes are, by definition, populations that contributed to later people. Countless others may have lived alongside them and vanished. This matters especially when we use words such as humanity. Around 900,000 years ago, there was no single global Homo sapiens population. There were different hominin populations, some potentially belonging to different lineages, spread across Africa and Eurasia. Our evolutionary tree was already branching. Later, it would produce Neanderthals, Denisovans, Homo sapiens, and other populations whose relationships remain subjects of research. Some of these groups would meet again. They would interbreed. Genetic traces of those encounters survive in many people today. Others disappeared so completely that we may know them only through fragments of DNA or a handful of bones. Human evolution is less like a ladder and more like a network whose branches sometimes separate and sometimes reconnect. A bottleneck somewhere inside that network does not automatically mean that every human-like population on Earth was simultaneously reduced to the same tiny number. This distinction becomes crucial for the title of our story. If the severe fit-coal estimate is correct, the bottleneck concerned a population ancestral to later humans, not necessarily every hominin alive on the planet. There may have been other populations. There may have been lineages that later vanished. The dramatic phrase "humanity almost went extinct" captures the evolutionary stakes, but the prehistoric reality would have been far less tidy. And yet, there is something remarkable even in the more cautious version. Our ancestry does contain repeated periods of restriction. Populations have expanded and contracted many times. Migration has repeatedly carried relatively small groups into new territories. Isolation has repeatedly reduced genetic diversity. Later, Homo sapiens populations would pass through additional bottlenecks and founder events as people dispersed across the world. The human population of today is enormous. For most of our evolutionary history, nothing remotely like it existed. Humans were rare animals. Even after Homo sapiens appeared, there were long periods when the entire global population would have been negligible beside the population of a single modern city. That changes the emotional scale of prehistory. An empty landscape was normal. Travel far enough, and you might cross enormous areas without encountering another group of humans. There were no distant city lights, no roads announcing that other people had passed recently, no aircraft overhead, no radio, no way of knowing how many others existed beyond the familiar social world. If another population disappeared 50 kilometers away, you might never know why. If one survived beyond a desert or mountain system, you might never know it existed. The species could be doing badly at a continental scale, while your own group experienced a perfectly ordinary season. This is why extinction can remain invisible to those living through it. Population genetics sees the curve afterward. The people inside the curve see individual lives. A child is born. Someone breaks a tool. Rain comes late. A group moves. Someone dies. Someone else reaches adulthood. Two populations meet, or they do not. The demographic graph is assembled from millions of events that never felt statistical to the people experiencing them. And this is also why scientists must be cautious when they translate genetic graphs back into human experience. The graph can tell us something happened to ancestral lineages. It cannot tell us what one person thought when the rain failed. It cannot tell us whether a particular group was hungry. It cannot tell us whether people understood that their neighbors had disappeared. Those details have to remain unknown. There is another absence that makes the problem harder. If an ancestral population truly declined by almost 99%, we might expect the archaeological and fossil records to contain some obvious signature of collapse. Instead, the physical evidence is sparse and ambiguous. There are gaps in the hominin fossil record around parts of the relevant period, something the original bottleneck researchers noted as potentially consistent with their result. But a fossil gap is not a population census either. Fossilization requires an unusual chain of circumstances. A body has to end up somewhere favorable for preservation. Sediment must protect it. Geological processes must avoid destroying it. The deposit must eventually become accessible, and millions of years later, someone has to search almost exactly the right patch of ground. Most ancient humans left no fossil that will ever be found. So the absence of bodies does not prove a population crash. It merely refuses to rule one out. That leaves us in an unusual position. Genetics offers a dramatic possibility. Climate provides a plausible background of long-term environmental pressure. The fossil record contains enough silence to keep the possibility alive. But newer genetic methods tell us not to become too comfortable with the most spectacular answer, and there is still no confirmed culprit. No single disaster explains why an ancestral population should have collapsed around 930,000 years ago and remained constrained for so long. Which makes what happened next, in the popular version of this story, rather ironic, because scientists and the public already had another catastrophe available, a much more visually satisfying one. This one had an enormous volcano. It had ash spreading across continents. It had the possibility of a volcanic winter, and it occurred while Homo sapiens actually existed. Roughly 74,000 years ago, Mount Toba erupted in what is now Indonesia. For decades, the eruption became attached to the idea that modern humans had been driven close to extinction. It was the perfect explanation for why our species seemed genetically unusual. A supervolcano, a tiny surviving population, a bottleneck, then recovery. There was only one serious problem. When researchers began looking closely at what people and environments were actually doing before and after Toba, the apocalypse started refusing to appear. Nearly 800,000 years after the ancient population crisis we have been discussing, the world produced the kind of catastrophe that seems perfectly designed for an extinction story. Around 74,000 years ago, beneath what is now the Indonesian island of Sumatra, an enormous volcanic system erupted. Today, the remains of that event are marked by Lake Toba, a vast caldera lake surrounded by the landscape left behind after one of the largest known eruptions of the Quaternary period. This time, Homo sapiens already existed. Our species had been present in Africa for hundreds of thousands of years. Human populations had begun dispersing beyond the continent at different times, although the history of those movements was far more complicated than the old image of one successful march out of Africa. And then Toba erupted. The scale is difficult to translate into ordinary experience. This was not simply a mountain sending a column of smoke into the sky while nearby people fled. The eruption expelled an extraordinary volume of volcanic material. Ash was distributed across enormous distances, leaving deposits that scientists can identify far from Sumatra. Closer to the eruption, conditions would have been devastating. Landscapes were buried. Ash entered water. Vegetation was damaged or destroyed. Daylight could be reduced beneath dense ash and atmospheric material. Animals would have faced the same collapse of food and water resources as humans. And even far beyond the immediately devastated region, material injected high into the atmosphere raised another possibility. Sulfur aerosols can reflect sunlight. Large volcanic eruptions can temporarily cool climate. If Toba injected enough sulfur into the atmosphere, researchers reasoned, perhaps temperatures dropped dramatically. Perhaps rainfall patterns failed. Perhaps ecosystems far from Indonesia began collapsing. Perhaps humans, already living in relatively small populations, were pushed toward extinction. It was an elegant hypothesis, and unlike the much older bottleneck around 900,000 years ago, this catastrophe had a culprit you could point to: a volcano. The idea became particularly influential in the late 20th century. The basic scenario was compelling. Toba erupts. The atmosphere fills with aerosols. A severe volcanic winter follows. Global temperatures fall. Plants suffer. Animal populations decline. Humans lose food. Population numbers crash. Only small refuges remain. Eventually, the climate recovers. The surviving humans expand. Their descendants inherit the genetic consequences of the bottleneck. It had almost everything a great explanation needs: a cause, a mechanism, a crisis, survivors, and a genetic legacy. It also provided an appealing explanation for something scientists had already noticed. Modern humans are genetically quite similar to one another, compared with what might be expected from a species distributed across almost the entire planet. All living people are members of the same remarkably closely related species, and population geneticists had long recognized evidence that our ancestors experienced periods of restricted population size. Toba seemed capable of turning those genetic patterns into a dramatic historical event. For a time, the pieces appeared to fit. The eruption happened around 74,000 years ago. Major expansions of Homo sapiens across Eurasia occurred later. Many famous examples of elaborate symbolic culture and Upper Paleolithic technology were younger still. It became tempting to connect all of these things. A catastrophe reduced humanity. The survivors recovered. Perhaps the crisis even helped create the conditions for major behavioral change. From there, the story could become more ambitious. Maybe surviving Toba selected for intelligence. Maybe isolated populations became more innovative. Maybe the catastrophe helped trigger a cognitive revolution. Maybe the few humans who survived were somehow different from those who came before. The problem with elegant prehistoric explanations is that the past has no obligation to remain elegant, and Toba left something unusually useful behind. Ash. Volcanic ash can act as a chronological marker. If researchers identify material from the same eruption in different locations, they gain a narrow geological horizon that can separate what happened before from what happened after. That makes Toba exceptionally valuable. Instead of vaguely asking whether humans lived in a region around 74,000 years ago, archaeologists can sometimes ask whether people were present below the Toba ash and whether they were still present above it. One of the most important places to ask that question was India. India sits much closer to Toba than Africa does, and ash from the eruption spread across large portions of the subcontinent. If the supereruption had caused an enormous ecological and human collapse, archaeological sites there seemed like reasonable places to look for it. At sites in India, however, researchers began finding something inconvenient. Stone tools occurred before the eruption, and stone tools occurred after it. At Toba, in northern India, archaeologists identified a long sequence of Middle Paleolithic stone technology spanning the period around the Toba eruption. The technological record did not show an obvious population disappearance immediately after the catastrophe. People had been there before. People were there afterward. Farther south, archaeological work at Jwalapuram also became central to the debate because stone artifacts were found in association with layers bracketing the Toba ash. The details and interpretation have been debated, including exactly who made these tools and how populations were connected. But the simple version of the catastrophe became harder to maintain. Humans in India had apparently not vanished. That does not mean Toba was harmless. Survival does not imply comfort. Ashfall can create serious local problems without exterminating everyone. Water contaminated by ash may become difficult to use. Vegetation can be damaged. Animals can move away or decline. People may have changed where they traveled and what they ate. Groups could have suffered losses that leave little archaeological trace. A population can survive an eruption while still experiencing months or years of hardship. The important point is narrower. The archaeological evidence did not behave as though the eruption had simply erased human occupation across India. And if people relatively close to Toba survived, the idea of a straightforward global human near-extinction required more evidence. Africa provided another test. If Toba had caused an extreme volcanic winter across the planet, environmental archives far from Indonesia should preserve signs of severe disruption. Lake sediments are particularly useful because they accumulate slowly, layer after layer, recording changes in local environments. At Lake Malawi in southeastern Africa, researchers identified microscopic volcanic material linked to the Toba eruption. That alone was remarkable. Material from an eruption in Sumatra had travelled far enough to leave a recognizable trace in an African lake, but the sediments surrounding that trace created a problem for the catastrophe hypothesis. Researchers did not find evidence for the enormous, abrupt East African climatic collapse that a severe, global volcanic winter scenario would lead us to expect. There was no clear sign that the region suddenly became catastrophically colder at the moment Toba ash arrived. The environment continued changing, as Pleistocene environments always did, but Toba did not appear to have imposed the simple climatic apocalypse once imagined. This distinction matters. A volcanic eruption can be enormous without producing identical effects everywhere. Atmospheric circulation matters. Latitude matters. Season matters. Ocean systems matter. Regional climate matters. How much sulfur reaches the stratosphere matters. How aerosols spread and how long they persist matters. The relationship between eruption size and global temperature is not a simple equation in which more ash automatically produces proportionally greater worldwide cooling. Toba was unquestionably a geological catastrophe. That does not automatically make it a human extinction event. More recent research has made the regional picture even stranger. Evidence from southern India has challenged the expectation of severe cooling there after Toba, with researchers instead reconstructing conditions consistent with regional warming. This does not mean the eruption warmed the entire planet. It means that the climatic response was complicated enough that the phrase volcanic winter can hide more than it explains when applied uniformly across continents. And that leaves us with an unusual contrast. The older bottleneck, around 900,000 years ago, may have been extraordinarily severe, but we have no confirmed single catastrophe to explain it. Toba gives us an extraordinary catastrophe, but the evidence for an accompanying human near-extinction is weak. The two stories fit together beautifully only if we ignore the 800,000 years separating them. This is why they are so often confused in popular accounts. One provides the dramatic genetic number, the other provides the dramatic volcano. Put them together, and you get a perfect YouTube sentence. A supervolcano erupted. only a few thousand humans survived, and they became the ancestors of everyone alive today. But the dates refuse to cooperate. The population crash to roughly 1,280 effective breeders proposed by the 2023 Fit Coal study begins around 930,000 years ago. Toba erupts around 74,000 years ago. They are not two pieces of the same event. They belong to completely different periods of human evolution. By the time Toba erupted, the ancestral population involved in the much older proposed bottleneck had been gone for hundreds of thousands of years. Homo sapiens itself had appeared. Human populations had developed technologies quite different from those used around 900,000 years ago. Long-distance movement of materials, pigment use, increasingly complex social networks, and other behaviors associated with later human culture already had deep histories. This becomes important because Toba has sometimes been attached to another appealing idea, that a catastrophe might somehow have helped produce the modern human mind. For that argument to work cleanly, human behavior before Toba should look substantially different from human behavior after it. But once again, archaeology makes the boundary untidy. By more than 300,000 years ago in East Africa, hominins were producing smaller and more specialized stone tools than the large Acheulean technologies that dominated earlier periods. At Olorgesailie, obsidian was transported from sources far beyond the immediate local landscape. Pigments were being used. Networks of movement and exchange appear to have extended over considerable distances. These behaviors existed hundreds of thousands of years before Toba. By the time the volcano erupted, Homo sapiens populations had already been experimenting with technological and social complexity for an enormous span of time. Evidence for symbolic behavior also refuses to wait politely until after 74,000 years ago. Pigments appear much earlier. Shell beads used as personal ornaments are known from more than 100,000 years ago. Engraved materials and other forms of symbolic expression appear at different times and places. The pattern does not resemble a light being switched on. It resembles a long, uneven accumulation. Some innovations appear. Some disappear from the archaeological record. Some return. Different populations develop different combinations of behavior. Connections between groups change. Population sizes change. Environments change. Culture does not advance in one straight line. That is a less dramatic model than a sudden cognitive revolution. It may also be much closer to what actually happened. And there is a deeper reason why this matters to our extinction story. If human survival depended partly on behavioral flexibility, then the important evolutionary development was not necessarily one miraculous leap in intelligence after a catastrophe. It may have been the gradual construction of a different kind of survival system, a system in which information could travel between people. A useful material could travel between groups. A new technique could be copied. A distant population could become a source of mates, resources, or knowledge. A person could survive an environmental problem not only because of what they personally knew, but because of what someone else knew. This is where human social life begins to look like technology. A hand axe can solve a problem directly. A social connection can solve a problem before you know you will have it. If drought affects your territory, but not the territory of another group, knowing those people may matter more than having the perfect stone tool. If a resource disappears locally, another population may know where it remains. If your group becomes dangerously small, contact with outsiders can restore demographic connections. Later, hunter-gatherer societies demonstrate how extensive social relationships can help buffer communities against local resource failures. We should not project every detail of those later systems deep into prehistory. But the principle is powerful. Isolation is dangerous. Connection creates options, and options are exactly what unpredictable environments remove. This may be one of the most important differences between merely surviving a catastrophe and becoming resilient to repeated catastrophes. Toba offers a remarkable example. Human populations appear to have persisted in regions affected by the eruption. Some may have moved. Some may have changed behavior. Some may have suffered badly. Some local groups may certainly have disappeared. But there is no convincing evidence that our species was globally reduced to a tiny remnant by the eruption. The volcano did not need to spare everyone for humanity to survive. It only needed to fail to destroy everyone. That sounds obvious, but extinction works asymmetrically. A catastrophe can kill enormous numbers and still fail completely as an extinction event if enough populations survive in enough places. Geographic spread becomes protection. Different environments become protection. Different diets become protection. Different social networks become protection. Diversity of behavior becomes protection. A species distributed across multiple ecological zones is harder to eliminate than one concentrated in a narrow habitat. By 74,000 years ago, Homo sapiens may already have possessed precisely this advantage. Not invulnerability, redundancy. If one population failed, another could persist, and survival somewhere is enough for the species to continue. There is an important caution here. The humans who survived Toba in India were not necessarily the direct ancestors of the people who later populated the region. A population can survive a famous catastrophe and still disappear afterward. This is another way prehistory resists heroic storytelling. Survival does not guarantee legacy. A group might endure ashfall, climatic disruption, hunger, and environmental change. Its descendants might continue for thousands of years, and eventually, that lineage can still vanish. Another population arrives. Populations merge. One expands, another contracts. Genes mix. The archaeological record becomes difficult to connect neatly with later ancestry. The people who survive the disaster are not automatically the people who inherit the future. This brings us back to the original question. How did a tiny number of humans save humanity from extinction? We can now see why the question itself contains a trap. There may never have been one tiny band responsible for saving everyone. There may have been many populations, some separated, some connected, some disappeared. Some survived catastrophes that others did not. Some contributed heavily to later humans. Others left almost nothing detectable behind. Our species did not necessarily pass through one narrow doorway and emerge safely on the other side. Human survival looks increasingly like a series of doors, scattered across landscapes and across time. Some closed. Enough remained open. And by the time Toba erupted, one of the most important things our ancestors had begun building was not a larger body, thicker fur, sharper teeth, or greater speed. It was a larger social world. That world would eventually allow humans to move information, materials, partners, and opportunities across distances no individual could manage alone. And it may help explain why a species that once existed in small, scattered populations became extraordinarily difficult to eliminate. The next part of the story, then, is not really about volcanoes. It is about connection. Because somewhere in the long transition from vulnerable groups to globally successful Homo sapiens, other people themselves became part of the survival equipment. A stone tool is easy to recognize as technology. It has an edge. It can cut. It can be carried from one place to another. If it survives long enough, an archaeologist may eventually pick it up and understand at least part of what it was made to do. A relationship leaves no such object behind. Friendship does not fossilize. An agreement between two groups leaves no convenient layer in the ground. Knowledge passed from one person to another may change both of their lives and then disappear completely when they die. This creates an unusual problem when we reconstruct human evolution. Some of the most important things our ancestors built may be among the least visible. By the time Homo sapiens emerged in Africa roughly 300,000 years ago, human survival was increasingly supported by more than individual skill. Archaeological evidence begins revealing wider movements of materials, changing technologies, and behaviors suggesting that information and objects were traveling through increasingly extensive human networks. At Acheulean in Kenya, a particularly important transition appears in deposits dating to more than 300,000 years ago. For hundreds of thousands of years before this transition, people in the region had used large Acheulean cutting tools. Then the technological pattern changed. Smaller, more specialized Middle Stone Age tools appeared. Some were made from obsidian, a volcanic glass capable of producing extremely sharp edges. The remarkable part was not simply the material, it was where the material came from. Some obsidian had traveled substantial distances from its geological sources. Stone does not migrate by itself. Someone carried it. Perhaps one person traveled to the source. Perhaps material passed through several groups. Perhaps exchange relationships were involved. We cannot reconstruct every transaction. But the distance matters because it suggests that the usable world was becoming larger than the immediate landscape around one group. Pigments also appear in this broader period. Again, caution is necessary. Pigment does not automatically prove art, ritual, or a fully modern symbolic system. Mineral pigments can have practical as well as symbolic uses. But together with technological changes and long-distance material movement, the evidence contributes to a picture of human behavior becoming increasingly flexible and socially connected. This is hundreds of thousands of years before Toba. That simple fact creates a serious problem for the idea that the supereruption somehow awakened the modern human mind. Whatever eventually produced the cognitive and cultural capacities characteristic of our species had been developing for a very long time. There was no obvious morning when humans woke up modern. Instead, different abilities seem to appear at different times. Planning becomes visible in technology. Materials move farther. Pigments are collected and processed. Objects eventually become ornaments. Engraved patterns appear. Different populations develop different traditions. Some behaviors disappear from the archaeological record and later return. Human culture begins looking less like an invention and more like accumulation. And accumulation requires memory beyond the individual. A person can discover something useful. For that discovery to become culture, someone else has to learn it. Then someone else has to learn it from them. The information has to survive the death of its inventor. This is where population size and connectivity become important in a way that has nothing directly to do with genes. A larger social network contains more potential teachers, more observers, more opportunities for useful innovations to spread. If one group loses a skill, contact with another may reintroduce it. If one population encounters a new resource, knowledge of how to exploit it can potentially travel. If a local environment fails, relationships elsewhere can create alternatives. This does not mean prehistoric people maintained some peaceful, continent-wide mutual aid organization. Relationships between groups can involve competition as well as cooperation. Territory matters. Resources matter. Outsiders can be dangerous. Human social life has never required everyone to like one another, but even complicated relationships can move information and genes. And for small populations, both matter. Consider the problem of mates. A small group can survive perfectly well for a generation, while still facing a serious, long-term demographic problem. Children grow up. Potential partners within the group may be close relatives. Some age groups may contain few individuals of one sex. A few deaths can make the imbalance worse. Contact with another population changes the possibilities immediately. One person moving between groups can connect genetic lineages that would otherwise remain separate, repeated across generations. Such movement can reduce isolation and help maintain diversity. No one involved needs to understand genetics. They only need social systems that allow people to move. This is an important distinction between biological evolution and lived experience. Genes benefit from connection. People experience visits, partnerships, kinship, conflict, separation, marriage-like arrangements, where such forms existed, or other social relationships that we cannot reconstruct precisely for these ancient populations. The demographic effect emerges from ordinary social life. Information can travel the same way. Suppose one group discovers that a particular resource remains available during a difficult season. Another group encounters them. Knowledge passes. The second group now possesses an option it did not have before. Nothing biological has changed. No mutation was required. The population became more resilient because information moved faster than genes. This is one of the great advantages of culture. Genetic adaptation is powerful, but it is slow. Cultural adaptation can occur within a lifetime. If climate changes, evolution does not need to wait thousands of generations for humans to grow a new anatomical feature before they respond. People can change tools, change routes, change foods, copy another group. Move, teach, remember. That ability does not make environmental pressure disappear. It changes the speed at which humans can respond to it. And over the long history we have been following, speed matters. The ancestors living around 900,000 years ago had already possessed cultural traditions, especially stone technologies, for immense spans of time. But later Homo sapiens increasingly appears to have expanded the scale and complexity of cultural transmission. This may be a better way to understand what was once called the cognitive revolution. The older model was dramatic. At some point, around 70 or 50,000 years ago, humans supposedly underwent a sudden transformation. Symbolic thought flourished. Art appeared. Language became fully developed. Technology accelerated. Modern behavior arrived. The timing seemed especially convincing when European Upper Paleolithic sites provided spectacular evidence of cave art, ornaments, sophisticated tools, and other cultural remains. But Europe was never the beginning of the human story. As African archaeology improved, the timeline stretched backward. Pigment use appeared earlier. Personal ornaments appeared earlier. Complex stone technologies appeared earlier. Long-distance movement of materials appeared earlier. Evidence of planning and social networks appeared earlier. Behaviors once gathered together under the label modern did not arrive as one package. They accumulated unevenly. This changes the question from what mutation suddenly made humans modern to something more interesting. What happens when a species becomes increasingly capable of preserving, combining, and spreading information? An intelligent individual is useful. A connected population can be much more powerful. One person knows a water source, another knows how to work a particular stone, another recognizes plants, another has traveled beyond the familiar territory, another knows people living there. Individually, each possesses limited information. Socially, the group has access to more than any one brain can contain. This is a kind of distributed memory. And unlike a larger brain, it can extend across distance. The implication for survival is enormous. A drought can destroy local knowledge by making the local environment irrelevant. A network can provide knowledge from somewhere else. A disease or accident can kill a skilled person. A network may contain another person with similar knowledge. A small group can lose population. A network can reconnect it with others. The system creates redundancy. Redundancy is rarely glamorous, but it is one of the foundations of resilience. If your survival depends on one spring, the spring is a vulnerability. If you know 5, the failure of one is inconvenient. If your group depends on one expert toolmaker, that person is a vulnerability. If many people understand the technique, an accident is less damaging. If your entire population occupies one ecological region, a local catastrophe can threaten everyone. If related populations occupy several environments, catastrophe has to reach all of them. This may help explain why the Toba eruption, enormous though it was, apparently failed to eliminate Homo sapiens. By 74,000 years ago, humans were not concentrated beside one lake, waiting for one disaster to decide their fate. Populations existed across different environments. They used different resources. They possessed flexible technologies. Some were already far outside Africa. A disaster in Sumatra could be devastating without being universal. The species had begun spreading its risk. That is a very different kind of survival from the one our much earlier ancestors may have faced. And it introduces a strange possibility. Humanity did not necessarily become safe because individual humans became extraordinarily difficult to kill. We remained vulnerable animals. We still needed water frequently. We still suffered infections. We still broke bones. Children still required years of care. Cold could kill us. Heat could kill us. Predators could kill us. Starvation could kill us. What changed was the system surrounding the vulnerable individual. Tools extended the hands. Fire extended the usable day. Clothing, later in human history, extended the climates people could tolerate. Social knowledge extended memory. Networks extended geography. Culture extended experience beyond one lifetime. A person could benefit from discoveries made before they were born by people they had never met. That may be one of the most consequential changes in the entire human story. It also makes the idea of a single cognitive revolution increasingly unnecessary. There did not have to be one neurological miracle. Biological evolution and cultural evolution could interact gradually. Brains capable of complex learning made richer culture possible. Richer culture rewarded learning. Larger networks allowed more information to persist. More persistent information allowed increasingly complex technologies. Those technologies allowed people to occupy new environments. New environments created new problems. New problems rewarded further flexibility. The feedback could continue without any single generation crossing an obvious line between ancient and modern. This process was not smooth. Human populations could lose complexity as well as gain it. If a network collapsed, knowledge could disappear. If population numbers fell, rare skills could vanish. If groups became isolated, cultural repertoires could narrow. Innovation does not automatically accumulate forever. It needs people. This brings the ancient bottleneck back into the story from another direction. If the population really did fall close to the severe levels proposed by Fitcole, the danger would not have been genetic alone. Small, fragmented populations have fewer opportunities to preserve and exchange cultural information. A demographic bottleneck can potentially become a cultural bottleneck. That does not mean Acheulean technology suddenly vanished during the proposed event. The archaeological record does not justify such a claim, but it illustrates why population size matters beyond reproduction. Humans increasingly survived through information. Fewer connections mean fewer pathways for information to move. This also helps explain why the simple phrase, "the survivors saved humanity," is misleading. Survival is not an action performed once. No prehistoric group knew that its descendants might eventually populate the planet. No one deliberately preserved Homo for the future. People solved immediate problems. They fed children. They moved toward water. They repaired tools. They maintained relationships. They learned. They copied. They reproduced. They survived another season. The evolutionary consequence came afterward. Enough of those ordinary actions continued for long enough that the lineage did not end. There is something almost absurd about comparing that world with ours. Today, humanity is so connected that information can cross the planet in seconds. A drought in one country can be observed from another. Weather satellites watch storms develop. Seeds can be transported between continents. Medical knowledge can be copied perfectly. Millions of times. A person can speak to someone thousands of kilometers away without leaving a room. The network has become enormous. Our ancestors had nothing remotely comparable, but the underlying principle is recognizable. Connection creates options, and options are survival. There is one final complication. Connections do not only occur between members of the same population. Much later, as Homo sapiens expanded across Eurasia, our ancestors encountered other kinds of humans. Neanderthals, Denisovans, perhaps populations we still know mainly through genetic traces. These encounters were not always barriers between separate species. Some involved reproduction. Genes moved between lineages that had been separated for hundreds of thousands of years. Many living people still carry evidence of those encounters. So even the ancestry of modern humanity is not the product of one isolated group marching outward and replacing everyone it met. Our history contains reunion. Populations separated. They changed. They met again. They exchanged genes. Some disappeared as distinct populations, while parts of them survived inside others. This makes the idea of the last humans even harder to define. Which humans? Which population? Which lineage? At what point? The closer we look, the less human evolution resembles a narrow line. It resembles streams that separate, wander through different landscapes, and occasionally flow together again. Some streams dry up, others continue. and the river that eventually reaches us contains water from more than one source. By now, the original mystery has changed considerably. We began with the image of perhaps 2,000 humans standing between our species and extinction. We now have something less cinematic but more remarkable. Ancient populations moving through unstable environments, groups separating and reconnecting, knowledge surviving because it passes between people, genes surviving because people pass between groups, catastrophes striking some regions while missing others, lineages disappearing without taking every part of themselves with them, and culture gradually turning a physically vulnerable primate into an animal capable of surviving environments far beyond the one in which it evolved. There is still one question left beneath all of this. If our ancestors were so vulnerable, why are we here while so many other human lineages are not? The answer is not simply intelligence. Neanderthals were intelligent. They made sophisticated tools, controlled fire, cared for members of their groups, exploited difficult environments, and survived for hundreds of thousands of years. Other hominins also endured enormous climatic changes. And yet today, only one human species remains. To understand why, we have to stop looking for the moment humanity was saved and look instead at the many human populations that were not. For most of our evolutionary history, being human did not mean belonging to one species. There were other humans. Some lived at the same time as Homo sapiens. Some occupied enormous territories. Some survived through climatic conditions that would have been difficult for any human population. Some made sophisticated tools, controlled fire, hunted large animals, cared for injured companions, and maintained traditions across thousands of generations, and they are gone. This is an important correction to the comforting idea that humans are naturally good at surviving. Our lineage survived. Many others did not. Neanderthals are the most familiar example, partly because their world overlapped so extensively with ours. They inhabited Europe and parts of Western and Central Asia through repeated glacial cycles. They were capable hunters and skilled toolmakers, and evidence from their sites reveals behaviors far removed from the old caricature of a dim, brutish cave dweller. When Homo sapiens expanded farther into Eurasia, the two populations encountered one another. We know this because some of those encounters remain inside living genomes. Many people with ancestry outside sub-Saharan Africa carry a small percentage of Neanderthal-derived DNA. Denisovan ancestry also survives in varying proportions in some modern populations, particularly in parts of Asia and Oceania. So when Neanderthals and Denisovans disappeared as distinct populations, they did not vanish completely. Parts of them entered us. This is one reason extinction becomes surprisingly difficult to define once populations can interbreed. A population can cease to exist as a recognizable group while some of its genes continue for tens of thousands of years. Its cultural traditions may disappear. Its physical characteristics may become diluted. Its territory may be occupied by others, but pieces of its ancestry survive inside another population. Human evolution is full of endings that are not quite complete. There were other endings that may have been much more complete. Different Homo populations expanded into Eurasia long before the major later dispersals of Homo sapiens. Some survived for immense periods. Others seem to appear only briefly in the record. Many left no known living descendants. That is worth remembering when we talk about migration. Reaching a new continent is not evolutionary victory. It is simply arrival. A population can migrate successfully, establish itself, reproduce for thousands of years, and still disappear. This matters especially for the familiar phrase, "out of Africa." It sounds like an event. A population leaves Africa, spreads across the world, and becomes us. The real history was considerably less tidy. Hominins had moved out of Africa long before Homo sapiens existed. Later, early Homo sapiens populations also dispersed beyond Africa at different times. Some of these movements apparently failed to contribute much ancestry to later populations. Others eventually became part of the major expansions that populated large portions of Eurasia and beyond. At Toba in India, the archaeological sequence associated with the period around Toba contributes to this more complicated picture. Humans were present in the region before the traditionally emphasized later expansion of Homo sapiens around 60,000 years ago. Who exactly these toolmakers were and how much they contributed to later populations remains debated. But their existence raises a useful possibility. People can survive the famous catastrophe and still lose the larger evolutionary contest afterward. Imagine the timescale involved. A population survives Toba. Children are born. Generations pass. The eruption becomes something no living person remembers. Thousands of years later, the population may still disappear. From the perspective of archaeology, survival happened. From the perspective of ancestry, the line may still end. There is no contradiction. This is why the phrase "saved humanity" needs to be treated carefully. No single generation can permanently save a lineage. Survival has to happen again in the next generation, and the next, and the next. Every population is temporary, unless reproduction and connection continue. This was true when effective populations may have numbered only thousands. It remains true with billions of humans alive today. The difference is redundancy. A local disaster today does not normally threaten the entire species, because humanity occupies almost the whole planet. In deep prehistory, local and regional disasters could affect a much larger proportion of the human world. A drought does not need to cover Earth if most of your population lives within the drought. A disease does not need to infect millions if only thousands matter demographically. A volcanic eruption does not need to destroy a continent if a vulnerable lineage occupies one narrow region. Geography changes the meaning of catastrophe. This helps explain why luck deserves a place beside intelligence in the human survival story. Evolutionary success is often described afterward as though the survivors possessed whatever quality survival required. But the environment does not distribute tests fairly. One population may encounter several severe droughts in succession. Another may occupy a region where water remains available. One group may become trapped between deteriorating habitats. Another may have an open migration route. One may encounter a new disease. Another may not. A small difference in geography can become a large difference in ancestry thousands of years later. Natural selection matters. Behavior matters. Technology matters. Social networks matter. But contingency matters too. Our ancestors were not necessarily the winners of a fair competition. They were the population whose chain of survival never quite broke. And even that statement hides enormous complexity, because our chain absorbed pieces of other chains along the way. This gives us a different way to think about Neanderthals. For a long time, their disappearance was framed as a contest. Modern humans arrived. Modern humans were smarter. Neanderthals lost. The evidence does not support such a simple ranking. The disappearance of Neanderthals probably involved multiple pressures and processes, rather than one decisive deficiency. Population size mattered, climate mattered, competition may have mattered, interbreeding mattered, disease may have played roles that remain difficult to reconstruct. Homo sapiens may have possessed larger or more extensive social networks in some contexts, allowing resources, information, and people to move across wider areas. But the exact balance remains debated. What we can say more confidently is that Neanderthal populations were generally small and fragmented, and that returns us to the central problem of this entire video. Small populations are vulnerable, not because every individual is weak, because there is less redundancy. A population of highly capable people can still disappear. Imagine two groups with equally skilled individuals. One belongs to a network of many communities distributed across a broad region. The other has only a few neighboring groups. A severe local shortage affects both. The first population has more possible connections beyond the affected area. The second has fewer. No individual needs to be more intelligent for the first system to be more resilient. Scale itself changes survival. This may have been one advantage increasingly available to Homo sapiens. As populations expanded and maintained broader networks, local failures became less likely to become total failures. And once human groups began occupying very different environments across Africa and Eurasia, the species gained another form of insurance: environmental diversity. A drought in one region does not necessarily affect another. A cold interval may damage one ecosystem while creating opportunities elsewhere. A volcanic eruption can devastate its immediate surroundings without reaching every human population equally. A species distributed across different habitats becomes difficult to eliminate with one event. The strange thing is that this protection emerges without anyone planning it. No prehistoric council decided to diversify humanity's geographic portfolio. People moved because they needed food, because populations expanded, because neighboring territories offered opportunities, because environments changed, because other people were there, because other people were not there. Thousands of local decisions gradually created a species-level defense. Humanity became harder to kill because humanity became harder to reach all at once. This may be the most important contrast with the proposed bottleneck around 900,000 years ago. If the severe bottleneck was real, the ancestral population was both small and potentially vulnerable to environmental fragmentation. By the later history of Homo sapiens, populations had spread across a much wider geographical range. There were still bottlenecks. There were still local extinctions. There were still failed dispersals. But the number of places in which some humans could survive was increasing. Eventually, people occupied coastlines, deserts, forests, open grasslands, highlands, and cold northern environments. Each expansion required adjustment. Food changed. Tools changed. Clothing and shelter became increasingly important in colder regions. Local knowledge accumulated. Culture diversified. The species became less dependent on one ecological solution. This is a remarkable development because anatomically, humans remained vulnerable. Put an unprotected human into extreme cold, and the body fails quickly. Remove access to water, and the problem becomes urgent within days. We cannot outrun many predators. We cannot digest many abundant natural materials without processing. Our children remain dependent for unusually long periods. Our bodies did not become universally adapted to every environment. Our cultures did. A human living in a cold environment does not need to evolve thick fur if clothing can be produced. A population does not need to evolve different teeth every time its diet changes if tools and food processing can alter what is edible. A group does not need biological knowledge of distant water if information can be transmitted socially. Culture allows one anatomy to occupy many ecological niches, and once that happens, extinction becomes harder. Not impossible, harder. This is also where the old idea of a sudden cognitive revolution loses much of its necessity. The decisive human advantage may not have been a single moment when the brain became modern. It may have been the gradual growth of cumulative culture and social connectivity until populations could solve problems collectively that individuals could never solve alone. No one person knows how to build a civilization. Even in a small foraging society, no individual necessarily contains every useful piece of ecological and technological knowledge. Human survival increasingly depends on access to other minds. That dependence is ancient, and there is a price. Social networks can fail. Populations can become isolated. Knowledge can disappear. Conflict can block movement. Disease can travel along the same connections that carry people and ideas. The system that creates resilience can create new vulnerabilities. There is no final technological solution to extinction, only changing forms of risk. For most prehistoric populations, however, one risk remained particularly severe: being too few. This is the thread connecting the proposed 1,280 breeder bottleneck, later human dispersals, Neanderthal decline, and the populations that survived Toba. Numbers are not everything, but numbers create possibilities. More people can mean more potential partners, more variation, more teachers, more learners, more neighboring groups, more routes through which information can travel, more chances that somebody survives a local disaster, and more opportunities for a population to recover after losses. This does not mean growth is always beneficial, or that prehistoric humans sought large populations. Resources impose limits. More mouths require more food. Large groups can exhaust local environments quickly. Disease transmission becomes easier when people concentrate. Human demographic history repeatedly involves expansion, followed by contraction. But below a certain scale, the danger reverses. There can simply be too few connections. That may be the real significance of the ancient bottleneck hypothesis, even if the famous estimate of 1,280 ultimately proves wrong. It forces us to confront how thin the ancestral thread may sometimes have been. Maybe it was 1,280 effective breeders. Maybe it was 5,000. Maybe 10,000. Maybe population structure makes a single global number misleading. The precise figure matters enormously to geneticists. For the larger human story, another fact matters too. There was no guarantee that the lineage leading to us would survive. Other human populations demonstrate that clearly. They existed. They adapted. They endured. And then their independent histories ended. Our ancestors could have done the same. There is no evolutionary rule requiring Homo sapiens to appear. No rule requiring Homo sapiens to leave Africa. No rule requiring our populations to survive climatic fluctuations. No rule requiring children to be born in sufficient numbers. No rule requiring separated groups to reconnect. No rule requiring Toba to spare enough environments. No rule requiring every migration route to remain open. We are looking backward from the only outcome that happened. That makes survival appear inevitable. From inside the process, it was anything but. If one could stand somewhere in Africa 900,000 years ago and somehow know the future, there would be no obvious reason to look at one small population of tool-making hominins and predict billions of descendants. Much later, standing among early Homo sapiens, there would still be no guarantee. Other humans were successful too. Some had existed longer than our species had. Some were adapted to environments our ancestors were only beginning to enter. Yet today, every person awake in a city, every person listening in bed, every child born into the modern world belongs to the one surviving human species. Not the only human species that was intelligent. Not the only one that made tools. Not the only one that survived ice and drought. Simply the one whose network of ancestry never completely ended. And now we can finally return to the number that began this story. 2000, or 1280, or 5000, or perhaps many more distributed among populations, our models still struggle to reconstruct. The exact number may remain disputed, but by this point, the number is no longer the most interesting part. The real question is what had to continue when everything around those populations could change. Enough water, enough food, enough children, enough movement, enough knowledge, enough connection, enough luck. Not forever, just until the next generation. And then the process had to begin again. We began tonight with a number, roughly 2,000 humans, reduced in the scientific version of the claim to an estimated effective breeding population of about 1,280. It is the kind of number that immediately creates an image, a tiny remnant, the last survivors, a nearly empty world, a species balanced on the edge of extinction. After travelling through almost 1 million years of human evolution, however, that image has become much less certain and much more interesting. The proposed bottleneck around 930,000 years ago may have been real. One genetic method suggests that an ancestral population declined extraordinarily sharply and remained restricted for approximately 117,000 years. Other genetic methods disagree. The population may never have fallen nearly that low. Ancient groups may have been divided and reconnecting in ways that make a complicated population history resemble a catastrophic bottleneck when reconstructed from modern DNA. For now, we cannot settle that argument, and there is no need to pretend that we can. What we can say is that the ancestors of later humans passed through a period of profound environmental and demographic change at a time when climate rhythms were shifting and habitats repeatedly reorganized. Some populations disappeared, others persisted. Connections changed. The evolutionary lineage continued. Then, almost 800,000 years later, Toba erupted. This time, there really was a spectacular catastrophe. One of the largest eruptions of the Quaternary tore through Sumatra and scattered volcanic material across immense distances. For a while, Toba seemed to provide the missing apocalypse. Perhaps this was the event that nearly destroyed Homo sapiens. Perhaps only a tiny population survived. Perhaps the survivors expanded and eventually became us. But once again, the evidence became less cooperative as researchers looked more closely. People remained in India across the eruption. East African environmental records failed to reveal the simple, devastating volcanic winter once expected. Regional climate responses proved more complicated. Toba remained enormous. the human extinction became uncertain. And the third part of the familiar story weakened as well. There is no convincing evidence that the eruption suddenly transformed the human mind. The technologies, pigments, long-distance material movements, social connections, and early symbolic behaviors associated with increasingly complex human culture have histories extending far deeper than 74,000 years. Modern human behavior did not need to emerge from one desperate population standing in volcanic darkness. It had been developing unevenly for hundreds of thousands of years. So the simple story falls apart. There was probably no single moment when 2,000 people saved humanity. There was no known night when the future of our species depended on one campfire remaining lit. No surviving group understood that it carried the future population of Earth. No one knew there would someday be Earth covered with cities. They had immediate problems: water, food, distance, injury, children, weather, other people. Sometimes the solution was a stone edge. Sometimes it was fire. Sometimes movement. And increasingly, it was information carried from one human mind to another. This may be the most important thing we have found along the way. Human survival became collective long before humanity became numerous. The individual body remained fragile. Culture made that body more adaptable. A person could not grow fur when the climate became colder, but people could eventually make better protection. They could not evolve new teeth whenever available food changed, but tools and processing could change what they were able to eat. They could not carry an entire landscape inside one person's memory, but knowledge could be distributed among many people. They could not control rainfall, but they could move. They could not prevent every local population from disappearing, but if enough populations existed in enough different places, local extinction no longer meant total extinction. There was no single invention called resilience. It accumulated. A useful tool preserved, a route remembered, a child taught, a material carried from somewhere distant, a stranger incorporated into a group, a population moving rather than remaining in a failing environment, a new food accepted because the old one had become scarce, a connection maintained with people living beyond the familiar territory. None of these actions needed to save the species by itself. They only needed to improve the odds. And survival, over evolutionary time, is built from odds. This also changes how we should think about the humans who disappeared. Neanderthals did not vanish because they had somehow failed to become properly human. Denisovans were not simply unsuccessful drafts of us. Other Homo populations were not waiting for Homo sapiens to replace them. They had their own histories. They survived for immense spans of time. Some encountered our ancestors. Some exchanged genes with them. Parts of those populations still survive inside living people. Others disappeared more completely. Their extinction reminds us that longevity is never guaranteed. A lineage can survive for hundreds of thousands of years and still end. Seen from that perspective, our own existence becomes slightly stranger. Every living person is connected through an uninterrupted chain of reproduction, extending backward beyond Homo sapiens, beyond the proposed ancient bottleneck, and eventually beyond anything we would recognize as human. Every link reproduced before the line ended. That statement sounds trivial until you consider the amount of chance contained inside it. Across that chain were droughts, climatic shifts, injuries, predators, diseases, failed migrations, volcanic eruptions, population collapses, periods of isolation. Children who survived difficult years, adults who reached other populations, groups that found water, people who moved before conditions became impossible, and countless ordinary seasons in which nothing spectacular happened at all. Those quiet periods mattered just as much. Evolutionary history tends to attract our attention to catastrophe, because catastrophe leaves a dramatic question behind. How did anyone survive? But most survival probably occurred between catastrophes: eating, learning, traveling, resting, raising children, repairing things, maintaining relationships, doing tomorrow what had worked yesterday, while remaining flexible enough to change when yesterday's solution stopped working. For the people living those lives, there was no grand evolutionary mission. They were not carrying humanity through a bottleneck. They were simply alive, and perhaps that is why the phrase saved humanity is both wrong and, in another sense, strangely appropriate. Nobody deliberately saved humanity. But humanity was saved anyway, thousands of times, through ordinary acts that allowed another generation to exist. The famous 1,280 may eventually prove to be an inaccurate estimate. Future genetic methods may revise the population upward. New fossils may change the chronology. New archaeological sites may reveal populations where today we see empty spaces. The severe bottleneck hypothesis may survive scientific scrutiny, or a more complicated history of separated populations may replace it. That uncertainty should remain part of the story. Because the most important conclusion does not depend on exactly 1,280 people, the human past really was populated by small, vulnerable groups. Our evolutionary family really did lose many branches. Human populations really did experience repeated climatic disruption, isolation, expansion, and contraction. Homo sapiens really did survive enormous environmental changes, and our species eventually developed a remarkable way of reducing the danger of local failure. We spread the risk across people, across groups, across knowledge, and eventually across the planet. Today there are billions of us. From a demographic perspective, that would be almost incomprehensible from the world in which this story began. At night, the presence of humanity can be seen from space. Cities produce enormous fields of light. Aircraft cross oceans. Information moves between continents almost instantly. Food grown in one region is consumed in another. Human beings now occupy environments ranging from tropical forests to deserts, high mountains, Arctic settlements, and islands separated by thousands of kilometers of ocean. We have become extraordinarily numerous. But underneath all of that complexity remains the same basic biological dependence. We still require water, food, shelter, other people, knowledge, and a world capable of supporting us. Technology has changed the scale of those dependencies. It has not abolished them. That may be the quieter lesson contained inside these ancient extinction debates. Humanity is resilient, but resilience is not invulnerability. Our ancestors survived because enough options remained available often enough. Some could move when environments changed. Some populations survived when others disappeared. Knowledge accumulated. Connections widened. Culture allowed adaptation to happen faster than anatomy alone could manage. And luck remained part of the equation. There is no reason to turn that into a heroic myth. Our ancestors did not defeat nature. They remained part of it. They survived inside changing ecosystems through a combination of biology, behavior, culture, geography, cooperation, competition, and circumstances no one could control. And after all of that, perhaps the most accurate answer to our opening question is surprisingly modest. Did 2,000 humans save humanity from extinction? Maybe there was once an ancestral population with an effective breeding size close to that number. Maybe future research will confirm something like it. Maybe the true population was substantially larger and more fragmented. But there was almost certainly no single band of 2,000 people standing alone against the end of humanity. The real survival story is longer, messier, and far more human. There were populations that vanished and populations that remained. People who separated and people who met again. Technologies that persisted. Knowledge that was lost. Knowledge that spread. Environments that failed. New landscapes that became homes. And generation after generation of people who knew nothing about extinction curves, genetic diversity, Homo sapiens, or the distant future. They only knew the world immediately around them, where water might be found, which stone would break correctly when animals moved, where it was safer to sleep, who belonged to their group, who lived beyond it, when to stay, and when it was time to leave. Somewhere across that immense sequence of ordinary lives, the thread leading to us became thin, perhaps very thin, but it never quite broke. And eventually, after nearly 1,000,000 years of climatic change, migration, isolation, reunion, catastrophe, adaptation, and chance, that thread reaches a very different kind of night. A quiet room, a screen glowing nearby, and someone listening to a story about ancestors who could never have known that anyone would still be here to tell it.